And I believe that's an issue that both there's research that needs to happen, and there's also work in the standards bodies and the implementers and the developers who keep making mistakes to go complain about, well, this is the easy way to do it. Why is this insecure? Shouldn't the easy, in general, I believe that the easy way should be the secure way. That's often not true on all platforms, be it open source or proprietary. And so I would like to think, and I see some glimmers of efforts to try to make it so that the easy way is the secure way. But there's much more to be done on that, and I think there'd be, again, a lot of help doing that would be wonderful. I see a lot of interest in open standards, particularly in a number of governments around the world, and I think that's a good thing. I think that there is still a major fight about whether or not, well, a major fight. In some places, there is still, what in my mind is this bizarre notion that you can have an open standard and not be royalty free. In my mind, if there's I'm not opposed to patents per se in other, especially, well, in the non-software field. We'll talk about that in a moment. But especially in the software field, it makes no sense to allow patents or royalties and then say it's a standard. The whole point of those things is to be exclusive, is to forbid use. Okay, so I think we need to be very, very clear that to be an open standard, it must require royalty-free use, period. Because if it requires any royalties at all to use a standard, it can't possibly be a standard around the world. It can't really be a standard at all, frankly. Which leads me to another issue, which is software patents. Those of you who know me or know some of my writings know that I'm very much opposed to software patents. I think they were a horrific mistake in the U.S., and unfortunately several other countries have managed to import that mistake. I know obviously there are a number of other countries which don't have this particular problem, but I would certainly encourage people to be aware very carefully about thinking about software patents and that sort of thing. It is not, in my opinion, been very effective. In fact, it's been extremely effective at harming innovation as opposed to helping it. And as far as the future goes, that's an area, frankly, I do not know the answer on what will happen in the future, but I can certainly hope that they will go away. Let's see. As far as education goes, I mentioned some other things earlier, but I believe that there is going to be an increasing rise in the use of open source and the development of open source software in colleges, universities, higher learning, and so on. The combination of the two makes sense. If you look at the history of open source software, a lot of it comes from the educational world, where this whole basic idea of collaboration and sharing sort of built into the ethos. And so it makes perfect sense that these two would be even more aligned in the future, and I think that will happen. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Okay, my thoughts on the future of open source for like 10 years, who dares to go beyond that. So in my talk I showed the exponential growth that we had measured a few years ago, and our more recent data, not finished as a study yet, shows that this is continuing and that the open source adoption, use and development, existing number of well-working projects is eating exponentially in closed source and is eating into the total amount of work being done in the software industry. So that keeps on going with implications like those for education that we just heard, that there'll simply be a demand for more open source education, so we can proactively provide it or literally be pulled there. I believe that this is actually, though, changing how we do some of the education in open source, because there is no single defined open source process. How do you teach open source? Well, you can teach a tool, but the spirit and the development processes, vary drastically. No open source project is like the next one. So what I see is basically a mashup of many different influences being pulled in. First of all, it is already broad, and then we pull in software engineering techniques, for example, from agile methods. So at my school, I teach back-to-back agile methods of software development and open source software development. In my talk, I also addressed single vendor open source, where a single firm is developing open source software, is going to market with such an approach. I believe that is turning out to be the superior business model for software product firms. So there's no need to help these firms. Venture capital will simply do its thing and support these types of firms. And it applies really a lot of benefits for customers as the superiority of this model is based on the user innovation it harnesses, and that literally means that the products tend to be superior to closed source, to closely based, closely guarded innovation. So the benefits for customers are superior products, less lock-in, and easier or lower switching cost if you have to move on because something bad happens to the company. Now, I would like to point out that there's one possible misconception, which is that open source or single vendor open source at least is always cheaper. So I don't quite subscribe to that. I believe any rational software firm, that's what they have to do in the interest of shareholders, will try to get as much as possible. So I view it as a historical development that the new breed of single vendor open source firms to get into the market, and because the model allows them to operate at lower cost, can come into the market with lower price points. I don't think that if they actually can afford it, that prices won't go up. And why shouldn't they? It's a superior product. Why shouldn't they be charging as much as they can? So while historically prices may be comparatively low, I expect them to creep up over time. Community open source. Well, so I mentioned the switch from the traditional open source to somewhat of a professionalization of community open source through software foundations to make it more sustainable, to get individual developers out of the headlights and make it sustainable, because now there's an organization, a non-profit, an open source foundation backing the software, which makes the long-term survival more likely. I see that happening more and more because that's the natural way as you protect a project. Many projects will just be well served to join, say, the Apache Software Foundation. Why do all the overhead of your own foundation? But there will be lots and lots of platforms that we haven't really don't typically look at, because we usually think Linux and middleware and what have you. But if you think at all the industry verticals, healthcare, oil and gas, of course, what have you, they have their own platforms in some sense, and they may want to form foundations around community open source software that might spring up there. We actually do see a bit of that already. Not so much that like the end of the supply chain customers are asking for it, but more in the middle of the supply chain customers are asking their suppliers for an open source approach. The example I made was GenIVI. It's the automotive industries where the car manufacturers are asking their suppliers to build on open source. The example GenIVI is about in-vehicle infotainment, that your stereo, your navigational device, how you plug in your iPod, like how Bluetooth works. This is all supposed to be in the future running on a Linux stack, and it's being pushed up the supply chain from the customers to the suppliers as a demand. And for that, the customers have literally enforced a consortium, and I think that's the way of how it will be more like in the future, where like strong industry interest is actually driving some of the community open source. And of course, from that, we will see some more benefits on innovation. I'll come to that in a second. Just let me quickly address cloud computing. It feels like it's the next big thing. Well, it is the next big thing, of course. It can create a different type of lock-in than source code lock-in. It's the data lock-in, it's the standards or non-existing standards lock-in, which is strictly not about the source code, but of course about freedom in a broader sense. So I think the FSF might eventually not want to drop the software part of it because it's about a broader set of freedoms. But if you just take the narrow view of open source, I think cloud computing will not really harm open source, because if the open source software that a cloud computing platform or services provider uses, if that platform is based on open source, if it's non-differentiating, they will want to contribute back because